Hi, everyone. We are back again with another installment of the Coppola Valley School of Brain Frames training. This one is going to be about sequencing frames. So, we're going to start off with what is a sequencing frame? So, a sequencing frame is when you put things in a sequence, so in order. Another way to say that is chronological order, which means in the time that it occurred. So 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m., right? So putting things in order. The nice thing about sequencing frames is that you can also add little details here if you want to say a little something more about that event. For a sequencing frame, the events are in boxes and there are arrows in between the events. It's very important that you remember the arrows and that the arrows follow along. So for instance, after this last event here, maybe you want to go down and then over, but it's really important for students that the arrows follow the chronological events. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how we use sequencing frames. Again, another reminder, this is the same reminder from the Telling Frames presentation. We really want to use graphic organizers mindfully. And so that means with intention, you have a specific purpose in mind for why the students need to do this graphic organizer. If you are just randomly using graphic organizers without really integrating them into your classes, into your lessons, it's not going to make a big difference for students. And as we know, graphic organizers can make a really big difference for students and really help them learn effectively. Okay, so first we're going to talk about some primary examples. So in primary, you could be sequencing the events of a story. That is a very, very important reading comprehension skill. When students hear a story, when they hear a series of events, their ability to tell those events in order is a very important developmental reading comprehension skill. The nice thing about sequencing frames is that you can also draw pictures. You don't have to use words in the boxes, especially for primary, and I'm going to cover that in my example. Okay, so here's a story from one of the PAF readers. It's called Sita's Maps. Sita looks for her maps. I had 6 maps in the car, she said. Karma took the maps, said Dad. Sita ran to Karma. I had 6 maps in Dad's car, said Sita. Karma had the maps with her. She took the maps to Sita. Sita took the 6 maps to the car. Okay. So here is a extremely poorly drawn example of a sequencing frame done in pictures. So first we have Sita. We know that it's Sita because I drew this little S on her dress. Okay, so we have Sita and she's at the car and the question marks show me that she's confused. So if a student were to draw this for a sequencing frame, I would feel so confident that they know what's going on in this story. Okay, the question, like showing confusion, the car, Sita, they're showing me that they know what's going on. Okay, next we have this person who is much bigger than Sita, so I'm going to assume that's Dad, and he's saying, Karma. So he's telling Sita that Karma is the one with the maps. Okay, here we have Sita approaching Karma. Karma does have the maps, and she is going to give them to Sita, and then Sita takes the maps to the car. This is by no means perfect, but this is a pretty solid representation of what happened in the story. If I'm a teacher and I'm looking at this, a student drew this, they've covered all the major characters, Sita, Karma, and Dad. They know that there's a car. They know that they're looking for a map, that's the kind of conflict in this story. And basically at the end, that Sita gets what she wants. She gets the maps and she brings them back to the car. So for reading comprehension, this is a very solid representation that the student knows what's going on in the story. Okay, so again, to make brain frames meaningful, if we wanted to reuse this sequencing frame, we could say, okay, everyone, we read Sita's maps, you made a sequencing frame. Now you are going to retell the story of Sita's maps to your class using your sequencing frame that you made. So instead of having students reread the story out of the book, they're using their own interpretation and therefore their own words to describe what happened in the story. So I included an assignment idea. The PAF readers have tons of stories. What you could do is you could have students work in groups and assign different groups different stories and support them in making sequencing frames and then telling the story to students who didn't read that story. So then it's even more meaningful because it's the student's responsibility to explain what happened in this story to their classmates. And so they really need to do a good job with their sequencing frames. Obviously, that would require a bunch of teacher support, making sure that they read and understand and their sequencing frames are good before they share them with their classmates. But it would be a nice kind of project-based group work activity when we're back in the classroom, obviously. Okay, so accommodations for sequencing frames. Students might be more comfortable drawing pictures, as we mentioned. Honestly, I wrote class 1, but I think even classes 2, 3, my 6th grade students still prefer to draw pictures, and I think that's fine as long as they're representing their learning. That is the most important thing, okay? So even if your students are in class 2, 3, 4, and they're drawing pictures for their sequencing frames, that's fine. Again, these sequencing frames, these brain frames are meant to help them. So whatever helps them, as long as it's accurate, is good. For younger students, you're definitely going to want to provide them an outline of the boxes and arrows. So you don't want to just give them a blank sheet of paper. You'll want to give them at least the blank boxes so that they have some structure of where to draw. Okay, so sorry, I'm just like erasing quickly. So you'd want to give them something that looks like this, right? Some blank boxes so that they have somewhere to get started. As students progress with their sequencing frames, maybe you could take out the arrows so that they have to draw their own arrows. And then obviously as students get older, maybe they'll be able to draw the boxes and arrows themselves. But our younger students, we really want to provide that structure. Okay. Another thing you could do is you could make the sequencing frame and then cut out the events in little boxes so that they have to put them in order. So here we have, again, all the events from Sita's maps. And so I would look at these events and kind of see what's happening and say like, okay, here's Sita being confused. Okay, so I'm going to move that to the front. Sita's smiling here. She has the maps. I know that that happens at the end. Here's Dad. He's the one who tells Sita where to find the maps. And so then I'll put this one there. Okay, I've put the events in order. And then I can draw my arrows. So that's a great activity for students to also assess their reading comprehension. Are they able to put the events of a story in order? And this doesn't require any reading. Our younger students have a lot of trouble reading independently. And so using the pictures, you're still assessing their comprehension without having them actually have to read and possibly get confused. Okay, some other primary examples, you could do something like how to grow a plant, putting in the seeds, watering it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, showing the passage of time. Here's a little one I did of a morning routine. You wake up, you get dressed, wash your face, brush your teeth, right? Students could draw or write their morning routine. That's something that they would all be very comfortable doing. A recipe is another good example. So you put in the oil, you put in the onion, you put in the spices, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very easy thing for them to understand. Okay, so this is a non-example, meaning that this is something that you would not want to use a sequencing frame for. This is an old class 3 example from Coppola. So this sequencing frame is about our town, Surkhet, and it's talking about how Surkhet has changed over time. So you hear time and you think, okay, yeah, sequencing frame, time. But if you look at the content of these boxes, of these events, it's really not a sequencing frame. So it says it's changed a lot in the last 20 years. Most people were farmers. There were no factories. Now there are factories. People work in these places. This is not really a sequence as much as it is a description. And so this would be much better suited to a telling frame where you said, okay, changes in Surkhet, and then listed all those events around it. Okay, so you want to make sure when you're using a sequencing frame that there actually is a clear passage of time from one event to the other. All right, so now we're going to look at some secondary examples. So for English and Nepali, and actually for social too, it's basically the same because so much of social is history. And what is history but a story? So English, Nepali, social, when you have these stories, these retelling of events, that's very, very easily suited to a sequencing frame. In science, you also talk a lot about processes and doing demonstrations or doing experiments, things where you have clear steps happening in order. So that's another really good way to use a sequencing frame. So if you are an English or Nepali or a social teacher, maybe you read a story in class. If you're in social, maybe you learned about a war or an event or a law that passed or something. Sequencing frames are a really good homework assignment. So it's going to tell you right away when the students come in the next day, did they understand the story? Okay. It'll tell you if they grasped the main points. Something I didn't type into this presentation, but what I think is really important is in their own words. When I was teaching 6th class English, I would have them do sequencing frames. And what they would do is they would take little chunks of the novel and pop them into a box in the sequencing frame. That's not helpful. The whole point of a sequencing frame is that you're only taking the most important parts, the most important events. So it's really important that students are describing things in their own words, because that's when they're going to tap into their higher order thinking skills and move from remember to understand. We'll know that students understand if they are able to make a sequencing frame with things in their own words. Now, a lot of our students struggle with language, and maybe they're going to have a really hard time putting things in their own words. They can also draw pictures. These are to benefit the students, okay? So as long as they are demonstrating their understanding and you know that they understand the content, pictures are absolutely fine to put into their sequencing frame. And obviously with secondary students, you're going to get better pictures than you might with a primary student, unless you are my teacher and then you're still getting primary level drawings. Okay, so for science, I remember a classic memorization that I've seen students studying for exams is preparation of methane gas. Okay, so maybe you have students draw a sequencing frame to show the different steps of preparing the methane gas. Anything in chemistry where you have to add things in certain amounts, I think that's really helpful. Our science fair project, my group made soap. If I wanted to make an academic connection, if I wanted to kind of really enforce the process of making soap, a sequencing frame would have been a really good way to do that. They could draw a sequencing frame of how they created their soap. I mentioned here that it's really good for assessment. Like I said, on a test, you could say, draw a sequencing frame that shows the preparation of methane gas or some other chemical. So I also was thinking, okay, science, we have so many KVS campus examples. And so I made a little sequencing frame that shows our water recycling. And I added little bubbles where it was appropriate to show extra details. So the rainwater is collected under the auditorium. I added a little note here that the tank under the auditorium has a 300,000 liter capacity, because that's not like super, super important, but it's a good detail to know. Then the water goes to the ultrafilter to make drinking water. There's a little note here that our drinking water on campus is more pure than bottled water. Again, not something that's super important we need to put in the events box, but it's a good thing to remember. Runoff from drinking water and washing hands is filtered 2 times to be used as gray water. And then here I put the uses of gray water, which are flushing toilets, washing buses. Then down here, the next event, solid and liquid waste are separated. I added a note here that says that happens beneath the futsal field. Then the solid waste becomes biogas. We use that for our Bunsen burners and for backup cooking gas. And then our liquid waste is filtered 1 time to use as black water. And the black water we use for irrigating the farm. So if you wanted to help your students understand what goes on in our watering system, this is a great graphic organizer to use because it very clearly shows the steps. And you could have the students create it. You could walk them. What would be amazing is if you could even walk them through the campus so that they're getting a visual of where these steps are taking place. Like, okay, the first step is the auditorium. Then the water goes over here to the ultrafilter. Then the water goes down here to the gray water filtering station. Okay, so that would be a really meaningful science activity because they would have this great graphic organizer to summarize their learning, and they would have the visuals around campus. Okay, so that's it for sequencing frames. Sequencing frames are wonderful. And in the next presentation, we're going to look at comparing and contrasting frames, which are going to help us find and organize similarities and differences. So thank you for watching and see you soon. Bye.